everyone to our weekly Zoom conference, tracking key issues and trends impacting ethnic communities. I'm Sandy Close, Director of Ethnic Media Services. Today, we're looking at the COVID-19 pandemic through a global lens, how human mobility has come to a standstill amidst a new wave of infections, while international migration continues to fall sharply. The impact on economies, labor markets, ultimately global mobility and migration systems is profound. To document these epic trends and suggest how governments can address them, we are honored to have one of the world's leading experts on global migration, Demetrios G. Papadimitriou, President Emeritus of the Migration Policy Institute. We will be sending you a link to his new report following the briefing. To zoom in closer to what these trends mean at the local level, we're honored to have two journalists, Vicente Calderon, editor of TijuanaPress.com News Media Services, and Krishna Raj Rao, a freelance investigative journalist based in Mumbai, India. On behalf of EMS, our thanks to Blue Shield of California for supporting these briefings, to our veteran reporters Pilar Marrero and Sumita Sarabji, and to our interpreters Oscar Arteta and Jackie No, who provide simultaneous interpreting in Spanish and Korean. We will send a video of today's call along with collateral material and extended bios and contact information this afternoon. Next week, we will not hold our weekly Friday Zoom briefing because of the Thanksgiving holiday. We will resume the weekly Friday briefings on December 4th. Now I am turning the conference over to our moderator, Pilar Marrero. Pilar, thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. Welcome everyone, all the colleagues that join us every week or some who join us occasionally. Thank you for being with us, and thank you to our panel. Remember, we have simultaneous translation, so for the speakers, speak slowly so they can translate. And I'm gonna just go right in and invite our panelist number one, Demetrios Papadimitriou, Distinguished Transatlantic Fellow and President Emeritus of the Migration Policy Institute. We are honored to have you here. The stage is yours, Demetrios. You can unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, welcome.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, Pilar, colleagues. I deeply apologize for having lost track of time. I don't know, somebody should just kill me, get it over with. So,
you're not late at all. You're not late at all. You're right on time. And we welcome you for your repeat performance to this group.
Thank you. You're most kind, Alexandra. So it is my honor, actually, rather than yours, to have a conversation.
I think we're having some issues with your audio. Do you have a mic or?
Well, my telephone, my
just the
laptop.
Maybe you just need to speak closer to the computer.
I brought it. It is my speakers
right now,
are 100%. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now, but when you go like this,
okay. I'm gonna stick
to the
very close.
Oh.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right. I apologize again. Okay. So I think it is important to have these conversations. As Alexandra mentioned, I wrote a long report. It was either a labor of love or a labor of something. And I must tell you up front that it is a dark piece because I think these are indeed dark times. So I'll start there. We already we're well on our way to having 1.4 million deaths around the world, making this pandemic the deadliest pandemic in over 100 years. We have had two pandemics in the last century beyond the 1918 pandemic, flu pandemic, and the death totals, if you can call it that, the loss of life was 1.1 million in one case and 1 million in a second case. They took place in the 1950s and the 1960s. And the United States lost far fewer than 100,000 people in each one of those cases. Today, the United States is approaching 260,000 deaths. And the world death total is, as I said, approaching 1.4 million. It is important for us to understand that we're not anywhere near gaining control of the pandemic. We have had some good news, all of them in the last week or so. And the good news are that two of the vaccines being developed, the one jointly with a German biotech firm, the other one an American firm on its own, that appear to be able to deal or protect 95% of the participants. And both of these are going to ask for an emergency right to distribute the vaccine. And all indications are that that will be granted. So as a result, we have hope. Unfortunately, for most people, the time between getting this emergency right license to actually distribute the vaccines and the time that most people will be able to have access to those vaccines is going to be about 6 or 7 or 8 months. So we're in for a very hard winter and a fairly hard early spring and full spring, which means that unless we do the kinds of things that everybody says that makes a difference, which is protect ourselves and others through face masks, avoid crowds, including avoiding something beyond family gatherings. In the Thanksgiving in the United States, other holidays elsewhere, we are going to have a recurrence, a resurgence of the virus. And if we learn anything from the 1918 pandemic, is that most of the deaths and the death total for the 1918 pandemic was over 50 million people. So if we learn anything from that, is that most deaths happen in the second phase or the second stage, meaning in the winter and early spring of 1919, rather than in the spring and early fall of 1918. So in order for us to be able to do better in terms of the outcomes for us, people, our families, our friends, we have to do all of the things that we know make all the difference. Let me be perhaps controversial and say that almost regardless what our political leaders have done or have failed to do, the biggest enablers of the recurring crisis is us. It is people. It is people who are not really listening to the experts, who are breaking the rules, who have some sort of a narrative that this is about freedom. People who have and say so, who are fatigued and who are worried about all of those things that government apparently, according to them, seems to be doing to them. And I think it's essential that we move off of this narrative and instead have, follow the rules. They're fairly simple. Now, what about borders and mobility? During the height of the first phase, almost all countries around the world closed their borders. Mobility ground to a halt. And after the first phase of the pandemic, as late as August and early September of this year, still over 70 countries continue to have their borders closed. For the rest of the countries, particularly the Europeans, but other parts of the world, there were tentative reopenings of borders. And indeed, as a result of that, movement, including migration, refugee resettlement, acceptance to adjudicate asylum applications, et cetera, sort of started to flow again. Of course, the last month or so, Europe has been in an even harder place than the United States is now, in the sense that the number of deaths, which is, one of the ultimate measures, but before you get there, hospitalizations, of course, is what it is that we need to look at, rather than the number of infections. When you look at those things, you realize that something did not work out. And that something also includes slight mutations of the virus, which is something that troubles epidemiologists very, very much. So borders sort of opened a bit, mobility sort of resumed a little bit, but the last 4 weeks, most of these countries have had to sort of pull back. And the challenge that they and every country around the world faces is very simply this: how can you reopen the economy? How do you slowly reopen the borders? How do you go back to having some mobility while at the same time protecting yourself and your population from the ravages of this particular disease, this particular virus? And this is really the challenge that everybody is facing. Now, as you will know, we will have a new administration in the United States. And, this is going to be an administration that's more forthright with and direct with American citizens. And we are going to have much more cooperation with other countries. But at the end of the day, to repeat what I said a few minutes ago, we have to do our part. It is essential that each one of us, does his or her part. It is also essential that we listen to the people who make, informed decisions, that we do not get involved in the fact that New Zealand has sort of conquered the virus, because we shouldn't forget that New Zealand is not only an island nation, but it is an island nation over there. And it has a very small population. And it closed and shuttered both its economy and its borders to mobility throughout most of the past 8 or 9 months. Nor should we be comparing ourselves to Taiwan, because Taiwan is a highly disciplined society. Again, it's us who enable the virus to spread. And that kind of sort of ability on the part of people to follow the rules is a big, big plus in trying to defeat the spread of the virus. I don't know what my time is, but I can stop here.
Great, because I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
So there's this argument between what comes first. Should we open the economy first, or should we attack the virus first? And that's become a political issue. But in terms of borders, what comes first? I mean, and how important is our borders and global mobility and the flow of workers for economies?
It is very important. And interestingly enough, countries are almost equally notable for the exceptions they have made during the border closures than the broad brush decisions that they have made about closing borders. So just to take an example from North America, the United States, Canada, and Mexico have agreed again and again and again and again to close their borders for all but essential travel. And it is here that the crux of the issue is found. What is essential travel? And we know what essential travel is by looking around us. People who do hard work in U.S. agriculture, in staffing, not just hospitals, but all people's homes and other lower level medical facilities. These are also people who are doctors and nurses and have the qualifications to actually manage the disease in larger hospital facilities. And it includes people who are highly, highly qualified, because many of these people, and I want to emphasize highly, highly qualified, not just run-of-the-mill people who just have a university degree, but people who are going to be able to participate and help countries develop further their research capabilities in trying either to, now we'll have, in a month or so, we will have many, many, many different vaccines, but in trying to see, what is the efficacy of these machines? What other things do we need to be doing as societies, as scientists? They're going to have to tell us what else we need to do in order to protect ourselves. So I imagine in about a month's time, by the end of the year, certainly, that borders will sort of open a bit more, ajar. And the reason for that is very simple for me. Having sort of thought about these things for a year or a decade or few. If we have tests that give reliable results within 15 minutes, and one was just approved, but let's say within 8 hours, people can take the test before they jump on an airplane, and if need be, they can take another test once they land to a place. So we can have testing that actually will make us feel a little more secure, because in order for travel to resume, not to its earlier period, but to resume slowly and gradually, people must trust that airlines, government, and individuals and families will all follow the rules. And we need to make all sorts of adjustments. So testing, yes. All of these antiviral drugs, they're not going to save. They're not going to be the same thing like a vaccine, but they will make the intensity of the infection much, much lower. As a result, fewer people will die. So here, the triad on this is fast and reliable tests, more progress with antiviral treatments, and a vaccine. Once we do this, and once we begin to trust each other and the government and airlines and everybody else, I imagine that some migration, significant migration, will resume, and certainly mobility will resume. I think, and I'll stop on that this is also a time for us to invest in the people who are in our midst. The immigrants, the foreign-born person who are in our countries. I don't care how they got to the United States, but for the last year, this entire year, they really bore the brunt of this virus. They have contributed, they have worked, they are the frontline workers. We need to make sure that everybody, all hands are on deck, and everybody contributes as we try to dig ourselves out of this vast hole that this virus has dug for all of us.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Papadimitriou, we have questions, but I want everyone to listen to the two journalists. One is in Mexico, the other one is in India. So I don't want to miss their connection somehow. So we're going to move on and hope that you can stay with us to answer more questions at the end.
Yes,
Thank you
yes,
so
ma'am.
much. All right. Okay, so let's go to Tijuana, the border area. My dear friend, long time friend, Vicente Calderon. Welcome, editor of TijuanaPress.com, news media services, journalist and producer. When I met him, he was a television reporter here in LA. So that's a long time ago. Vicente, tell us what's going on at the border and what's going on in terms of mobility and the issue of the pandemic and also the policies of immigration that have affected Mexico and beyond.
Well, thank you very much for the great opportunity to share the time and space with you, even when it is virtually, with the sign of the times. Well, for us who need to understand what's going on with the phenomena that we deal in a daily basis, the work that you guys do, and specifically the Migration Policy Institute, give us a great light and help us to broaden our vision in that sense. That said, I have to tell you that Tijuana, for those who are not that familiar with this city, is the synonym with migration. We are, as part of Mexico and the northwesternest part of the city. We are on the edge with the Pacific Ocean, but the edge of the country. We are neighbors with California. We are less than 3 hours away by driving in a car to LA. So that puts Tijuana as a kind of a hub for international migration. Originally, Mexico was an origin, a source of immigration or migration towards the US. There's a long history of relationship, but right now has changed a lot, not just for the pandemic, but the pandemic is the most recent changes that are affecting life and migration in Tijuana and through Tijuana. Right now, there's tens of thousands of people, mainly from Central America, waiting in Mexico their asylum requests to the US. This is due to a policy called Remain in Mexico, or with a euphemism, migration protection protocols, which are not really giving any more protection to the migrants, but just expelling them to do the waiting in a very dangerous part of the world, which is the northern border of Mexico. We also have a lot of people from Mexico who is also trying to get asylum in the US, something which is relatively recent that we haven't seen as much in the history of the two countries, because the US was very difficult to grant asylum from Mexicans. But we now have a lot of people, Mexicans, that are fleeing their hometowns due to the violence linked to drug organizations, to cartels, the Mexican cartels. And this is something new, because this is pushing people that was in areas who in the past were safe places, and now they are feeling the same violence and murder rates that we saw in other areas. And also, we have another big number of people who was living in the US for the last 20, 30 years and were repatriated or deported to Mexico, but many of them are staying close to their families, as close as they can, because the border limits the interaction and the closeness that they can have. So Tijuana is by now different breed of problem on its own immigration. But in the last years, we've become a more important route of international migration. We have lately seen, along with the people from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, the main countries of origin of the immigration, and they're requesting asylum in the US. We also have a lot of people from other parts of the world, mainly Africans. Different countries from Africa are sending their people here. This has been following a trend who has been changing. You have to keep in mind that Tijuana was the capital of illegal migration towards the US until about the 80s. And then a big change of policy in the US began reinforcing the borders and put a lot of more resources. They increased a border fence. They put a lot of more border patrol agents, and they were going after the employers. That was what we began with something called the Gatekeeper Operation. And you remember this very well, Pilar, because we were covering that from LA at that time. That makes some changes, but didn't stop the migration. Actually, did it more difficult. And what happened is Mexicans were, and many Latin Americans went on a cyclical migration. But when the government of the Clinton administration made it more difficult, many people were just bringing the families who were in Mexico and stopping the going back and forth. So that was one of the main changes. Then we also saw changes at the end of the millennia. During the 90s, we were seeing more people coming through Mexico. And I remember cases like Chaldeans from Iran fleeing prosecution due to their religious beliefs from Iran when Saddam Hussein was still in power. We saw a lot of Chinese immigration through the ocean, and they were landing on the coastline of the Pacific Ocean in Mexico. This is still going on, but it's very subtle and so very quiet, but it's still going on. And after the economic crisis of the 2008 in the US, we began to see another change. And that along with the economic crisis and the deportation rate that happened with the administration of Barack Obama, we get to what it was called net zero immigration rate. So as much Mexicans were going to the north, that as much Mexicans was coming back to Mexico due to the repatriations and the immigration policies in the US. So in 2014, then we have more Central Americans, or what the Border Patrol would call other than Mexicans, being arrested on the southern border of the US. So that means that the migration of Mexican was diminishing significantly, but the migration issue, the phenomenon was still going on due to people from other parts of the world. And that takes us to basically what we have seen. We saw a big spike on 2004 and 16 with Haitians leaving from Brazil, where Haitians affected mainly for natural disasters. They were able to move to the South America and to Brazil due to the construction of the infrastructure for the Olympics and to the World Cup, Soccer World Cup. But when the money ran out, they began moving, and they started to move towards the US, and they were traveling through several countries trying to get to the US. And that was when we began to see an increase of the number of people using Mexico as a route to go to the US. And then we get to the policy changes due to the Donald Trump administration, which are the most severe in many ways, because it has halted in many ways legal and illegal immigration. The number of asylum has reduced. The number of the quotas for refugees have been reduced by this administration, and this is what is putting us in what is going on, the reality we are living with. And now we get to the pandemic. And the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, who began in March, was just a perfect excuse to those extreme policies in the US. Right now, the US government praised itself because when somebody gets illegally through the land to the US, it takes less than 2 hours to send it back to Mexico, the express deportation, as they call it. So through this, the problem is that these policies have become reality in a very harsh ways. And mainly we are seeing the real consequences that become kids on cages or separation of families that is lasting for months and sometimes for years. And also people deported to their countries of origin to face death. This situation is putting a big burden, not on the governments, but mainly in social and the civil society, which is the one in the case of Mexico, taking it on its own to respond to the crisis that we are seeing along the U.S.-Mexico border, and that has changes with the pandemic. We are always looking for new trends, because what happens with social media, the word spread a lot more faster. And now we are seeing other groups using this route of Mexico, even with the terrible levels of violence that we are living in, as a way to find this conduit for their promised land as they see in the US. In one case we were talking recently was this smuggling organization of Armenians who began from Moscow to Cancun, which is on the other end of Mexico, and due to the corruption was able to bring them all the way through the more than 4,000 kilometers of extension between Mexico or the southern Mexico to the Mexican border. We only find out about that case because unfortunately a group of persons very sick was found in the trunk of a car in the San Isidro port of entry, which is the most intense or most busy port of entry in the northern hemisphere. So now we don't know exactly what's the result of what we are seeing due to the pandemic. We know that the conditions are more difficult because the surveillance and the control of the border is stronger from the U.S. authorities, and what it's doing is forcing the migrants to take more dangerous routes to trying to get to the U.S. We are seeing an increase of the number of people going through the sea, and so far the last fiscal year, we saw at least 5 people who died on the ocean trying to get across. In the last decade, along the U.S.-Mexico land border, we have seen about 12,000 people who died trying to get to the U.S. So the only thing that we know for sure right now is that the policies are not facing the tragedy that it's becoming the immigration through this area, the international tragedy, because it's not only Mexicans, but people from many other nationalities. We have seen now Venezuelans now that even though this is the longest route to get to the US from Central America, they're opting for this because they see it as less dangerous than other routes like Tamaulipas or other states or countries in the northeast of the Mexican border. I leave it to that and see if they need more information.
Okay, thank you very much. Because our other panelist is in Mumbai, India, I'm gonna allow him to speak now. I don't want him to be on the line for longer without speaking. So, and then we're gonna take questions, okay? So let's move on to Krishna Rao. He's a freelance investigative journalist from Mumbai, India. And when we spoke yesterday, he was taking care of a bunch of cats that he feeds. How are the cats, Chris?
Oh, Pilar. Yes,
Hi.
the cats are fine. They have been fed.
Oh, good.
And I'm surrounded by cats. You can't see them, but they're all here.
Me too.
Okay, so good to be with you. Good to be with all. It was a fascinating. It's been a fascinating talk by Demetrios and I forgot the name of the gentleman from Tijuana.
Vicente.
But yes, Vicente, yes. So you can call me Krish. It's easier to pronounce that way. So I want to talk about Mumbai And I want to talk about India, and I want to talk about the migrant situation here. I don't want to be very heavy on statistics, but 1 in 10 Indians is a migrant worker of some kind or a migrant entrepreneur. A worker is not someone is someone who's engaged by someone else, but it is very common to see a migrant entrepreneur who sells vegetables, sells a very good amount of vegetables, so he's self-employed, and then he sleeps on the sidewalk or sleeps, he's one of the homeless people. So this is a very different kind of a phenomenon that we have here. They are mainly North Indians who come to Mumbai. They see it as a place to earn money and then go back to wherever they came from, usually Uttar Pradesh or sometimes even closer towns or smaller villages of our state. So India is this continent-sized or subcontinent-sized uh, population, which is constantly on the move. The COVID crisis has hit us very, very hard. Then again, it has not. So in terms of deaths per million, something strange has been happening within the Indian subcontinent and neighboring regions. I think we can talk about Pakistan as being part of the subcontinent. We can talk about Sri Lanka, Nepal, these countries, the Asian countries, not Asian in the sense of Southeast Asian, but Asian as in South Asian countries. I could even hazard to talk about Saudi Arabia. We seem to be having a rather low mortality rate compared to the rest of the world. I mean, India is up there in number 2 position, right behind USA. But for some strange reason, our mortality rate per million is 1/8, and our total cases seem to be in the region of 1/6 per million population. So there's something very funny going on here, and we have noticed, people have noticed. I would like to say this in the context of how badly housed most people in Mumbai are, and how badly housed most Indians in urban areas are. We really are, we have no concept of social distancing, and it is practically not possible to social distance, because what we have in Mumbai is that about 50-60%, 60% I would say, or even more, of the people. Yes, that's a good question from Amar Gupta. He says, are you absolutely sure all the cases are being reported? So I'll address that question about under reporting, and I am one of the skeptics. So I am going to come back to that. Now, just to give you perspective, yes, how are the deaths of Indians being reported? Fine, I'll answer that. I'll answer that. So just to give you perspective on how I would say a very large proportion of Indians live, and I'll talk about the urban areas. I would say about 60-70% of the population of urban India lives closely packed together in slums where houses are not more than 2 feet apart. Your front door is not more than 2 feet apart from the other guy. And each house is not larger than a 10 by 12 room. And you got 7, 8, 9, 10 people packed in. So if it were a pandemic that were ravaging us because of lack of social distancing, then I feel, and it has been noticed and observed, and it's a widely discussed fact, that it would have been ravaging the slums, more particularly because they have shared toilets. You have one toilet per every 200-300 slum dwellers. So you can imagine what kind of hygienic conditions we have. Don't talk about washing hands. It doesn't exist. I mean, we wash hands, yes, but not with soap, not that way in the slums. Okay. So face mask, social distancing, all those things are close to non-existent. And don't even get me started on what it's like in the suburban railways. The suburban railways are absolutely jammed up right now. It is not. Yes, Henrietta says, is there some kind of natural immunity happening? So there's a lot of speculation here as to what is going on. Please check what I am saying in terms of statistics. Please check the worldometer and see what's happening. But I'll say this, the COVID crisis has hit us a lot less hard than I had anticipated or feared at the beginning of the crisis. I had personally expected there to be a lot of underreporting. And I'm a skeptic. Okay. I'm about as anti-establishment as they come. I don't see the bodies piling up on the streets. I don't see the bodies piling up in the hospitals. I don't see the body count rising alarmingly. I talk to a lot of people. I go to a lot of shops. I eat out. I eat street food, even now, today. Right? I don't see this healthy respect for COVID any longer. It was there. It was there until maybe May, June. We had this migrant crisis, migrant workers crisis because of this huge lockdown when the migrant workers were not allowed to go back to their cities. And then there was this flood of workers going back in desperation against government policies. They just started jumping into trucks and going home or walking home or cycling home. They probably just ran out of money and ran out of patience. And I have sent Pilar and Sunita and others quite a few videos of this phenomenon where I was also actively engaged in alleviating their conditions. So what I would like to say is there is a very strong feeling among Indians of all walks that we have taken this seriously for far too long. This sounds counter productive to say this, and it sounds like I would be if I were in the US, I would be a conspiracy theorist. But I am just voicing what is almost a mainstream belief in India. It's mainstream across economic demarcations, across demographics. The feeling is it doesn't hurt us all that much. We are not seeing mortality as high as anticipated. So the masks, yes, people are wearing masks. To some extent, they are sanitizing. But it is impossible to tell an Indian to, for example, I know how much we are taking lightly these things about temperature checks and face mask and sanitizing. We are taking it very, very, very lightly, and Indians in general are taking it very lightly. So I would be happy to answer questions. Underreporting was one question that was asked. I personally believe, having entertained that thought that there would be huge amount of underreporting, no, there isn't any underreporting going on in any substantial way. Maybe 1:2. I'll be happy to take more questions.
Thank you, Krish. Okay, so I want to ask Dr. Papadimitriou what he thinks about what Krish just said about India. Unmute. Yeah, you can unmute yourself.
Thank you. I'm a little slow. You have to forgive me.
That's okay.
So I do not know whether there's a natural immunity that has developed. You would think that Indians, according to what Krish told us, are not following any of the protocols, or many of the protocols that so many different countries have asked their citizens to follow, whether it's distances for the reasons that Krish, of course, identify, social distancing, contact tracing, personal hygiene, masks, wearing them on and off, or et cetera, et cetera. But clearly, about a month and a half ago, if I recall correctly, India was having death rates that were rising to the point where I think it may have actually caught up with Brazil in terms of gross deaths. But if you take something, a different measure, which is a more appropriate measure, which is deaths per capita, okay, then Krish is exactly right. You know, there is, you know, it has been a very light touch in terms of how the virus COVID-19 has hit the subcontinent. It is remarkable to me how little we still know about this particular virus. The more we learn about it, the more questions are raised.
Mhm.
And until we have answers to many more questions than, you know, we have answers to today, we're not going to be able to do nearly as well with this as we ought to. But again, another one of those sort of positive things. We're learning lessons that we can apply to the next pandemic, because no one that I speak with, and you know, I do lectures and whatever with, expects this to be something that will not reappear. No, there won't be another pandemic for 10 or 15 years. Already in the 21st century, we have had 5 pandemics. None of them spread like this COVID-19 did. None of them killed more than a few thousand people. In some instances, less than 1,000 people. Maybe they didn't kill that many people because they were caught very early in their development. But the lessons that we learned about what to do and what not to do will be particularly helpful for the next pandemic.
Okay, my colleague Sunita had a question about vaccines in the developing countries. And then I'll go to Sandy, who has a couple questions too.
Yes, hi. I have a question about supply chains and distribution of the vaccines that we have to date. Both need to be stored and distributed, frozen. And I'm concerned that the developing world does not have the infrastructure that it needs to be effectively able to distribute these vaccines. Do you have those concerns as well, Dr. Dimitriou?
Thank you. Please call me Dimitri. Forget the doctor and the Papa Dimitriou and all that. Just Dimitri, please.
Thanks.
I'm glad, Sandy, you're enjoying that. So, yes, I'm having exactly the same concerns. Distribution is going to be the soft underbelly of this, the whole thing. And we're going to have distribution problems throughout the world, but distribution in the least developed countries, particularly the ones that are sort of very large, okay, is going to be a problem that may indeed push the pandemic into the next year, meaning after 2021. But I will use a quote that the Deputy Secretary General of the UN put on the table about last May, I believe. He said, if we don't cooperate and pay attention to the needs of people in the least developed countries, the virus will have a boomerang effect. And what a concept, okay? We think that we've taken care of ourselves, and then like a boomerang, you know, it will come back to us as people begin to move again, and mobility builds up, and migration, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm deeply worried. There has been something similar to what Krish said about India. If you look at Africa with only 2 exceptions, South Africa and Ethiopia, okay? If you look at the rest of the continent has a remarkably low infection rate and low death rates. Now, a lot of this may have to do, some of it will have to do with the underreporting. Another part will have to do with misreporting, because if you don't start from the beginning, okay, you may have misreported, you know, deaths are something else. Demographers are very good at looking at the situation a year later, estimating how many people would have died in a regular year, and take the difference between how many people actually died and how many would have died. And then we're going to have a better measure of how many people really died in Africa. And for me, most of Asia is a puzzle, because it's not just, India with the conditions that Krish talked about, but, Vietnam has had just a handful of deaths. Thailand has opened up to travel and mobility, et cetera, the last 3 or 4 weeks, and they had a very low caseload. So something is going on in that part of the world that I'm certainly not an expert to be able to discuss and say why. Thank you for the question, Sunita.
Hey, thank you. Sandy, go ahead.
I want to ask, first of all, Mr. Calderon, what do you see as the impact the Biden election will have? Is the word out on the street now? And do you anticipate a new sort of effort on the part of migrants, despite the pandemic and the lockdowns, to go north? And with both Dimitri and Krish, migration and mobility have been like oxygen for the global economy. They've been the oil that has greased the activization of ordinary people. How quickly can mobility and migration resume if it's fallen by 50 to 70% in this year? How quickly do you think we can see it get started again? So first, Mr. Calderon, Vicente Calderon, and then Krish and Dimitri.
Thank you. Yeah, many people believe, and me among themselves, that one of the first crises that President Biden will have to face is the increase of people trying to get to the U.S. for several reasons. Well, we have seen a little bit of an increase, going back to more normal numbers of immigration from Mexico or from Central America towards the border are right now very limited, very few right now. But we believe that with a combination of issues like the economic hardship caused by the pandemic and the close of the economic activities in many of the countries in Central America, many people will have to flee looking for more options. And also, we just have to keep in mind that we just have 2 terrible hurricanes hitting those areas and making conditions even worse. So they are waiting, they were hoping that many of migrant families were hoping that Biden was the winner of this election, because they knew that before the pandemic makes it easier, the policies that Donald Trump institutionalized were the ones who were making it more difficult to go across. We have a reduction very significantly for the combination of the policies and later the pandemic. But the policy in itself forced many people who were sent back to be waiting in Mexico to go back to their families and to their countries of origin, and that decreased the number of people. So unfortunately, yeah, I think the conditions will be worse for them, because with all these restrictions due to the pandemic, will be more difficult, more dangerous, and more costly for them to get to the US illegally or legally.
Great. Dimitri, do you want to answer Sandy's question regarding when will global migration flows be back to normal?
Unauthorized migration, undocumented migration, as we call it here, irregular migration, as the European, whatever the word, the euphemism is going to take a while before it grows to the levels, let's say, that we had a few years ago. But it's not because people will not try. People will be more and more desperate. I think that Sandy put it, I don't know if she used the same word that I'm about to use, migration has become an essential lubricant, both for migrants, for households and communities from which they come and to households and communities in which they settle. That's not really going to change. Forget the ugly debates in the United States. You know, these are just ugly debates, and they're fairly ignorant debates, not because people are stupid, because people are promoting a particular political perspective. Okay, so we all know that. So, you know, I suspect that the demand for entering and working in another country will grow exponentially once borders sort of loosen up a bit. We already see that in Europe. We see extraordinary rates of deaths in the Mediterranean, but also in the Atlantic, as people from West Africa are trying to go to the Canary Islands, which is European space. Because in Europe, once you touch European space, you're in Europe. Makes no difference whether you're 500 miles or 5 million miles from, you know, Spain. Okay, so I imagine that we're going to continue to see more and more people trying. The profit motif that all the smugglers work under is going to sort of dominate everything. And there's something human about this. People thinking that somehow, if they're a little more careful, if they travel in a big group, if they're traveling with trusted friends and colleagues and family, et cetera, nothing will happen to them. Guess what? Things will happen to people. So while we're trying to sort of increase regulated migration, because we all know that we need migration, we also need to start testing other propositions. Namely, can we find different ways in which we can help people in place? You notice I didn't use the word about, you know, that politicians use, you know, that somehow, you know, you're going to come up and you're going to address the root causes and things like that. Root causes, as we found out, and the center knows that, from the US-Mexico love, etc. affair of the last 50 years, take 50 years before they can actually bring about a big difference. And they take, you know, a, whatever we call it today, you know, whatever the US, Mexico,
NAFTA, the previous called NAFTA.
The second NAFTA. It takes all of those things, you know, to bring some fruit. And I think we have to be careful about that. It takes time. More than time, it takes commitment. You know, no, you can't just invest for 3 years, say, you know, the numbers went up, if anything, so let's disinvest. That's not how things happen or should happen. In everything that we do, we have to be able to stay the course. We have to be able to explain to our people, our audience, meaning our electorate, why we do what it is that we do. We have to urge patience, and we have to help sending countries rebuild institutions and economies. We have to invest in all of these things and think of a time horizon of 2 decades, let's say, because Mexico is a big country, you know, but most of the rest of the Central American countries are relatively small countries. You can make a bigger difference in a shorter period of time in a small country. So can we have, and this is not a word, but I'll use it, the stick-to-itiveness that it takes for us to sort of turn things around? And I don't know the answer to this. And Mr. Biden will suffer from, you know, it's not a law, but I will call it a law, the law of unrealistic expectations. You know, if you follow US news, as most of you do, everybody says that they were responsible for electing Mr. Biden, and that they're going to hold him accountable for every word that he uttered. Guess what? They can try to do all of those things and destroy the Biden presidency. Or we can all pull together, cooperate first inside the United States, and then within the region. I'm sorry for talking too much, Pilar and Sandy. I
Never
apologize.
too much, never too much from you.
Yes, too much. Come on.
We like it. Krish, can you quickly tell us about when, I mean, you told us yesterday about the internal migration, people going from the city to the rural areas because there was no work. Do you expect that to reverse, and how do you see migration restarting in India?
Sure. So it has already reversed. It has already reversed, though not entirely. A lot of the people who fled, so to speak, because they were in stifling conditions. There were people living without income in small 10 by 10 rooms with poor ventilation, and they just fled when they ran out of money. They just walked home without water, without food. It's ridiculous the kind of hardships they went through. And they are back. A large number of them are back. And funnily enough, they are not bitter. In their head, they have sorted it out. They are very clear. They say it's not the pandemic. Their worry is not the pandemic. Their worry is not having an income, not having an occupation. They are very hardy people, more particularly the villagers and the small town people. They're very hardy people. They're not great physical specimens, but they're extremely hardy in mind and in heart. They don't have any bitterness. I'm amazed at the lack of bitterness that they have toward the administration. The administration threw them to the dogs. And you know what? People like me, the critics of the government, are much more bitter about it than the people who actually suffered by walking 1,000 miles in the hot sun with bad footwear or no footwear, traveled in hot trucks. It's ridiculous how little bitterness they have, and that is being borne out by the pattern of their votes. What I see going forward is in India, we have a very gung ho attitude to this whole thing, and it is, as I said, across demographics. We are very gung ho about it. Going forward, I don't think we are going to have much by way of restrictions and much by way of interstate travel. First of all, because interstate travel or travel from village to city and so on are absolutely the oxygen of our economy. There's no way the villages can survive without feeding off the economic movement that happens in the urban areas. And of course, vice versa, the products that come from rural areas to the urban area. There's absolutely no way we can do without their labor, and they can do without our resources and the economic movement. So the urban areas are the economic engines for the rural areas. It's not the farming. They are not self-sufficient. If you leave them, if you maroon a village, it just pretty much will die. So there's no way we can isolate. And I don't see this happening in any big way. I think all the governments, all the state governments and central government, and incidentally, the state government and central government are often at loggerheads in a situation which is very similar to a civil war-like situation in some degree. In spite of that, there is a kind of a consensus, a general consensus, which is, boss, we can't do this any longer. We can't do this much longer. I think we are coming out already. We are unlocking, whether you want to call it a lockdown or not. And globally, what I would see is there would be the immunity haves and the immunity have-nots. That is what like Dimitrios pointed out, it's a large part of Africa, large part of Southeast Asia, Thailand, Indonesia, all of them have the same pattern as I said about the Indian subcontinent. There seems to be a mysterious, inexplicable immunity. And no, it is not underreporting, because underreporting in this day and age of WhatsApp would not go it would not escape in India. We have a I mean, we may not have a free press, or free press has been tampered by the government, but we still have a very strong alt media. People like me are pretty much saying anything we want to say, and we are criticizing the government very vociferously, and we have a very robust kind of interaction on WhatsApp and all kinds of social media, YouTube, you name it.
Well, we need to come to a
Underreporting
close, Krish,
would not
because our time is off. It's 12:07 p.m. and I'm going to pass it on. Thank you so much. I'm going to pass it on to Sandy.
Well,
Yeah, thanks.
thank you, Krish. Thank you, Vicente. Thank you, Dimitri. I use your first names because this has been an extraordinarily intimate conversation. And because of that, it's been just gripping and illuminating and provocative. I thank you so much for your time. And honestly, beware, we will ask you back. It is great to get on the ground views and the remarkable expertise Dimitri brings to the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you all.
Thank you, colleagues. Thank you very much. It was wonderful being with you on this.
Yes.
Thank you.
It's wonderful to have you.
Thank
Bye.
you, Dimitrios, Vicente.